Welcome to the sixth video in our series on how to play Glorious Fleeting Napoleonic. In this one, we'll be covering the movement phase, which we're going to do in two sections. In this section, we'll cover charges. So there are three stages to the movement phase. There's charges, there's normal moves, and reacts. Charges, the sequence of them is active player declares all charges and then takes any tests that might be required. The non-active player will declare responses and take tests. The active player then moves the charges, and then the non-active player makes counter-charge moves where relevant. We'll cover in the second video, but you then do normal moves, which there's a sequence for, and reacts, which we'll cover in the next video. Just for completeness, and there's the movement distance chart on page 49. The main thing to remember for under charges is your charge move is the same distance as your normal move. In terms of charge requirements, have a look at page 44 that covers these. So I run through them. The target must be visible, obviously. The target must be in range, probably obviously too. Charges can be made conditional on friends moving out the way. So if two units are charging, and you need one to be out the way for the other one to get in, that's allowed. And there are times when a command test is required to charge. So look at the table on page 58. But all those requirements are actually cancelled if your target that you're charging is wavering. So it's pretty easy to charge a wavering unit. Charge restrictions, which are on the next page, page 45. So wavering units aren't allowed to charge. Cavalry cannot charge infantry in towns or difficult terrain. Infantry can only charge cavalry who are wavering or who are inside a building or terrain. So yeah, they can't even charge cavalry from the flank or rear, for example. Units cannot change formation in a charge. And then marauders, so think of Cossacks, they need to pass a command test to charge frontally, unless the enemy they are charging are wavering or are irregular lights, which includes marauders on marauders, for example. And then this rule isn't actually on page 45. It's one of the rules in the command test table, but I thought it's worth calling out. Infantry who wish to charge the same target as a cavalry unit must first pass a command test. So if you've got two units wanting to charge, that's normally fine. But if one of them is infantry, one of them is cavalry, the infantry need to pass a test. Okay, so let's talk about wheeling in the charge. So units can always choose to charge straight ahead. So you can see in the image there, charge straight ahead, pretty simple. However, if you want to wheel, then there's a sequence you've got to go through. So you wheel at the start of the charge. You can't move a little bit and then wheel. And then you must wheel so that part of the target is in front of the center of your unit and no further than that. So you're pretty restricted on how much you're allowed to wheel by. So once you've done that, you then complete your charge move in a straight line. So no further wheeling allowed. But there's an exception to this. So the rule that units must wheel is actually ignored if it means the unit cannot contact their target. So there are many ways this can happen. So this is just one example. In this image, you can see if A wants to charge that target, they're going to bump into the unit to the right of them if they obey the rule on the previous slide. So this is where there's an exception, and so in this case, they would wheel a bit further and then hit the target. As I say, there are many ways this can happen. This is just one example. So just remember the principle is if that rule is ignored if it means you actually can't contact the target that you otherwise could contact. When it comes to countercharging, so we'll talk about countercharging in more detail later, but countercharging and wheeling, so both units are now going to move, so it's a bit tricky. So there's a sequence to this. So the chargers wheel first until their center is pointing at some part of the enemy unit, as we saw on the previous slide. You then measure the shortest distance between the two units. In this example, it's 6 inches. And then as a third step, the chargers then move half this distance. So they've wheeled, they move half of the 6 inches, which is 3 inches. And then obviously the last thing is the counter chargers wheel to be parallel with the chargers. And then they move straight ahead into contact. So yeah, it's just a little bit tricky, worth working through on the kitchen table. Then on page 46, there's a rule about restrictions on multiple charges on a unit. So we don't want players getting too fancy and overpowering one unit. So here's the restriction on this table. So pretty much it's dependent on how much flank support you've got. So if you've got a lot of flank support, so if you've got no flank support, 3 units can charge you. If you've got 1 flank support, 2 units can charge you. And if you've got 2 flanks, flank support on both flanks, only 1 unit can charge you. So let's see what that looks like. So here are all the units, and there you can see A and C are giving flank support to B. So what that means is that B can only be charged by 1 of those enemy units, D, E, or F. They couldn't do some fancy wheeling and both pile in there. But and it's worth noting for the purpose of this rule that table edges count as flank support. So if C in this picture wasn't a unit, it was actually the side of the table, it would still qualify as flank support. The exception to that is what I said before, is that units can always move straight ahead in a charge. So I've shifted the example a bit here. So D and E, now if they both charge straight, could actually both hit B. And so in that case, the restriction is ignored, and you could put 2 into 1. So it's worth remembering that when you're actually protecting your units. So in this example, A is a little bit further back than B. If they'd been completely lined up, D and E could both have charged forward into B, as in the diagram, but D would also have ended up having to fight A in that case. And then just to visually show back to the table, here now B has no flank support, so in this case all 3 units can charge it. If it had 1 flank support, only 2 of them could charge it. And then just the last thing to note, you can see in the image there that F would actually bump into E, and so you can see how F can then actually slide. So the rule is that units can always shift up to 1 base width to avoid friends, table edges, or terrain as part of any move. So we're talking charges here, but any move you're allowed to make that shift. You're not allowed to shift for any other reason. Okay, so let's talk charge responses, which is covered on page 46. So you've been charged. Now, what are the responses you're allowed to follow? So the first one is you can stand and give defensive fire. We'll cover defensive fire in the combat phase. And things to note on this: so infantry must pass a command test to stand and fire versus cavalry. Otherwise, they must form square. So the default is to form square. But if you want to try and stand and fire, you have to pass a command test, which of course means you need a pip. So it's worth trying to pick on infantry who the commanders don't have any pips left. You charge them and force them into square. Is a tactic to think about. Artillery similarly can stand and fire. And then units that are charged who are wavering must always take a morale test. Then the other option, of course, is to form square. So if you look at the image closely there, you can see the small unit and the large unit have both formed square. And just note the facing of the bases. So they've turned them out to face outward to look a bit like a square. And note that infantry not in square. So if they hadn't been in square when they were charged, they would have to take the morale test, as we discussed. But the exception to that is if they were all in terrain or defending a river or stream or linear, they wouldn't have to take a test. And that if they were in a redoubt, they wouldn't have to take a test. Then we spoke about counter charges earlier. So cavalry versus cavalry, that's the other option. The other charge response is to counter charge. Some points to note here: you wouldn't counter charge your cavalry if you were wavering or if you were charged in a flank or rear. If you're charged by multiple units, your cavalry would countercharge the nearest one, and then you'd work through that contact as normal, and then the other charges would move into contact with the countercharging cavalry. And then marauders must evade 3d6 unless they're charged by marauders or if they pass a command test. So Cossacks don't want to hang around when they're being charged by formed cavalry, so their default is to evade. But can choose to try and pass a command test to stand if they wish, and they have the pips. Okay, what about when you charge and all your targets have moved out of range? So that's covered on page 48. So in this example, A has charged B. B, let's say, was wavering, so they took a morale test, and they routed, and they've moved out of A's charge range. So what are A's options? If A is impetuous or their charge is a pursuit move, which we'll cover later when we do the end phase, they must complete their charge move straight ahead. So they've got no choice. They just they just carry on their charge straight ahead, and they'll end where you can see the dotted line there. However, in other cases, if it was a charge but not with an impetuous unit, A could actually convert their charge into another legal target that was within 2 inches of B's original position. So in that example, you can see the A is wheeled and is now charged into C, and it's still part of the charge sequence. So C just responds as if they were the original target. So they could form square if they were infantry, they would countercharge if they were cavalry, and so on. Right, so let's cover charging flanks or rears. So we spoke about flanks and rears in the firing phase, but just to remind us, to hit a flank or rear, the charges must start with the center of their front rank behind the target's flank. So you can see in the diagram there, the yellow line is the C's front rank, and the red dot is D's center. And so that red dot is past the yellow line, and so they can charge them on the flank. But they must also be able to hit them with their front edge or corner. So there you can see D is wheeled, and they then hit the flank of C with their front left corner. So yeah, those are the 2 requirements to charge a flank or rear. When it comes to defensive fire, and which we'll cover, as I said, in the combat phase, but can you give defensive fire against somebody who's charged you in the flank? It depends on whether they're in your arc of fire or not. So in this example, you can see there that D has come into the volley fire arc of C. So even though they've been charged in the flank, they are a valid target. But if we adjust that a little bit, you can see here D has hit them from a more extreme angle, and so they wouldn't get any defensive. C wouldn't get any defensive fire against them. Okay. And then some additional points to note. So squares obviously have no flanks or rears, so they never count as being contacted in the flank or rear, even if they've been charged when they weren't in from behind the flank when they weren't in square. By the time the enemy get there, they are in square, and so they don't count as a flank or rear. Cavalry charge and flank or rear do not countercharge; they just stand and receive it. And then units contacted by reacting cavalry, which we'll cover in the next video, only count as being hit in the flank or rear if the reacting unit was behind the flank or rear at the start of the movement phase. So you could have charged into someone and exposed your flank to the reacting unit, but if at the start of your charge they weren't behind your flank, they don't get the benefit of it. So yeah, just play that one through on the dining room table to see what I mean. And that's it. So hopefully that's clear. Next video we'll cover the rest of movement. So we'll see you then.